Hi and welcome back to a new video. The marketing these days around mainboards is mostly about overclocking, at least talking about the more expensive ones like a Tachyon or like an Apex board or the Dark Hero. Most of those boards have very specific features when it comes to overclocking and also extreme overclocking, which is usually not that useful for the normal user. But the question is, what happens if we just try an average or more average board like this NZXT B550 board for extreme overclocking? We tested this specific 5950X on launch day with an Asus Dark Hero board. We achieved 6 GHz across all cores for validation and 725 MHz on Cinebench R20. And that's something I will just try to reproduce on the B550 board from NZXT, which is a bit cheaper than the Dark Hero. All right, let's see if we can get to the same values or if it will be absolutely terrible. We will find out.
Seasonic, the heart of your system.
Pretty satisfied with the board so far. I'm just doing my basic overclocking right now. That's why I'm just running with AIO, installed Windows and everything. And as you can see, my 5950X is currently running with 1.35 volt, 4.4 GHz across all cores, and also memory was very easy, 3600 on the memory and also on Infinity Fabric. Score is in line. At this point, I can absolutely notice that NZXT is working closely with ASRock together and seems to be a quite good harmony because the BIOS is absolutely flawless. That's what I'm currently experiencing as well from all kind of ASRock boards. They're very good when it comes to overclocking. All the settings I did, like all the memory settings and Infinity Fabric, all the voltages, everything was just applied on the fly on the first try. No issues whatsoever. That's something I absolutely appreciate. So for any kind of like normal overclocking, this would work absolutely fine. And now we're going to transition to XOC, but I'm not going to prepare that much actually, because I'm just going to do like 2 or 3 hours and I probably don't need that much insulation for that. Just some armor flex on the back side, a lot of tissues on the front side, because there are not that many components on this board on the front side. So yeah, probably won't face a lot of condensation or like other issues in that regard. Let's go. Most of you will already be very familiar with our insulation and mounting process. So for the base, we have this Armor Flex insulation foam, which will be put against the backside of the motherboard. We have this backplate of the GPU or CPU container on the back, and that is our mounting mechanism. And we're just using the mounting holes of the mainboard, and this way the insulating foam will be pressed against the backside of the mainboard. So this way, this will already be covered. And then we're just going to put some paper towel probably just around the socket area right here to protect it from any kind of condensation, and then we should already be good to go. We're going to use my Beast container in a modified liquid helium edition. That's something we used for a record several years ago when we visited Asus in Taiwan. But I just wanted to show you the internals of this cooler, because in the previous video a lot of people were quite fascinated or appreciated that they saw the internal structure of an LN2 cooler, and that is the best or the latest generation of a CPU container. You can see there's this main chamber where you essentially pour in the LN2 and then it can go outside through those fins right here. You can see on those holes there's a structure where the liquid nitrogen can go through and then go in the bottom of the CPU container. There's an additional structure milled inside down here, which you cannot see because it's covered by those plates. But yeah, that is the general structure of such a CPU container. It's pretty simple. And back then when we did liquid helium, we also added this hole in the center so we could inject directly the liquid helium into the bottom structure. This container is currently not for sale. I made like 20 or 30 pieces back then, but I will probably make new ones end of the year or maybe early next year. Since there's no dedicated overclocking software from NZXT, we're just going the old-fashioned way by overclocking out of the BIOS. So just set a basic profile, 4.4 GHz, 1.55 volt. We're going to cool down in a second a little bit to make sure that we can also run this fairly high voltage. And then again, 1.55 volt V-core for the CPU. Just set them basic settings like SoC voltage. It's not much more we have to do. In advanced menu, there's also AMD overclocking, and then LN2 mode. I'm going to enable this, and then we're pretty much good to go. We just hit minus 40 degrees Celsius, which is still not cold, but at least you can see the system didn't froze, so everything is still fine, up and running. But that should be a good temperature to just enter Windows at 1.55 volts and see if everything still works the way we want. You can see things are freezing up a little bit. I wrapped a towel just around the entire setup to protect it from any further condensation, especially like the SSD, which is sitting directly underneath. Also the memories and the mainboard itself, it's a little bit more protected if you wrap a towel around it. And we're just about minus 100 degrees Celsius all the time. Did some basic OC just to get used to this board with the Ryzen Master, but as you can see, like 5.1 gigahertz across all cores, which is not special so far, but just to get just to be sure that everything is running fine. And it's also Cinebench stable. I did like 10 runs already just to see how it behaves. But yeah, getting there. Okay, so temperature-wise, it's already a little bit reaching the limit, because as soon as I every time hit like minus 110, it's getting inside some kind of cold boot bug behavior, some cold boot behavior. Even though the CPU can run like minus 150 on the Dark Hero, so it's definitely not a CPU. So it seems to be like the mainboard doesn't like it if it's getting too cold. But let's see how much we can reach with like minus 100. This reminds me a bit of the early days from overclocking when everything was not made easy. So you just load an LN2 profile and you go, like the Apex boards, for example, for Intel sockets. They're so easy for XOC. But this kind of reminds me of the earlier days, which is also sometimes a bit more fun because you have to tweak things a little bit more. So raising SoC voltage helped a little bit to gain a little bit more temperature room, but only like 10-15 degrees Celsius. For vCore, I cannot go much higher. There's a limit of 1.55 volt in the BIOS. I cannot apply any higher voltage with it, which is also kind of fine for this type of product because it also protects the buyer or user at home, so he doesn't accidentally enter like 1.85 volt. And this way, because 1.55 volt, even with an air cooler, is not instantly going to ruin your CPU. That's actually quite good. But we're now going to try CPU-C suicide, all-core OC, what we can reach with like 1.55 volt. And right now I can go up to minus 125, and going lower will result in a cold bug. Something that also never gets old is kind of the way the Leidenfrost effect works on those containers. You might remember the footage from earlier when you saw those like LN2 bubbles just going across the surface and don't really make contact to the surface. But now, like minus 100, you can see how it instantly evaporates. That is because the Leidenfrost effect at this temperature has no effect anymore. Alright, it crashed, but we hit 6 GHz, and that was actually quite cool. I mean, it's pretty much the same stuff at what we achieved with the Dark Hero, so validation-wise, pretty satisfied, not even bad. You can see 5.5 GHz across all cores, actually 5.55 GHz past R20, but the performance seems to be a bit low. There was also some stuttering in between. Yeah, not sure. I will keep trying. Okay, so 5.6 GHz is not possible on this board. It must be temperature or voltage limit or the combination of both, because typically for those kind of frequencies, let's say 5.7 above all core frequencies, you need very low temperature just to make sure that the power consumption is held down low of the CPU. That usually helps quite a bit. vCore on that level probably doesn't even help that much anymore, but temperature is absolutely important. Anyway, it was a lot of fun to overclock with this board. It also shows that you don't really always need a board that costs like 700, 800, 900 euro to have fun overclocking. Obviously, you're not going to break any records with this, but if you just want to step into this, it might even make sense to get a cheaper board, which doesn't cost as much if it breaks, because that's something that can always happen. It doesn't even matter what kind of board you're getting, from which manufacturer, but there is always a risk involved, you know that, especially with condensation and stuff. It's always likely that your board breaks. And if you're new to this, it's maybe not that bad losing a, I don't know what this board costs, maybe like 250, 300 board, than I don't know, 700, 800 euro board, right? Anyway, was still a lot of fun overclocking this board. It also shows that it has 16 phases, and I think 14 are for the CPU, but they're doubled, so it's like 7 native phases. Still, it's absolutely enough. I mean, you can run 5.5, 5.6 gigahertz almost R20. That's absolutely nice. So no limit on the VRM, but so it also means that for ambient overclocking shouldn't be any issue. But something I didn't test obviously is the heatsink and heatsink design, because for ambient overclocking it will more rely on the surface area of the heatsink to make sure it can dissipate the heat output from the VRM. That's something I obviously completely neglected in this test. But otherwise, yeah, fun board, fun to test, and it also shows that you don't always need the most expensive board to have fun. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye bye.